That's okay. I'm here to talk about 500,000 lines of Python 3, or a tale of hilarity and woe. The joke is really important. So what exactly was I trying to do? Or some context. So Eventbrite was founded in 2007, and really this project has been sort of an archaeological dig. Like I didn't actually, I've been at Eventbrite for about 2 years, and it's a pretty big code base, and I felt like I was pretty competent and understood most of it, and I'd worked on a lot of low-level stuff, thought I knew what was going on. And this has really been very archaeological. So what I actually found when I started working on this was that, the company was founded in 2007, but there's code in there that's older. So we have a sort of a long history, and as you'll see, we have some sort of historical/hysterical artifacts that we still live with. So we're currently on Python 2.6, and that's primarily a deployment issue. We're hosted at EC2. We're still running Ubuntu 10.04. We're going to be on, as soon as we go to 12.04, real soon now, we'll be on 2.7. That'll be a great day. But I started thinking to myself, what about Python 3? Python 3 shipped a while ago, and just I started thinking about this a little bit, like, when would that day actually come? So I started thinking about Eventbrite 3, or Eventbrite on Python 3.3, the 3-iest Python 3 there's been. And that's about 500,000 lines of Python, as you know from the title, and about 2,700 source files. We'll get into a little bit later about what all that entails. So why would I want to undertake this, besides wanting a topic to talk about at PyOhio? Which actually was part of the reasoning. Well, there have been a lot of improvements in Python 3. A lot of things I'm really excited about using. There's iterable unpacking, which is sort of this amazing thing where you can now do A star B comma C is equal to range 5, and A will have 1, and B will be a list of 2, 3, 4, and C will be 5. Or because this works on any iterable, you can also give it a file. So you get the first line of the file, the last line, and everything in the middle. And this is I use Emacs, and this makes my Lisp heart happy. There's dictionary comprehensions, also in 2.7, but we're still 2.6, so it all seems new to me. There are set literals, which we end up using a lot of sets for sort of determining how to treat different requests, and so being able to type these as opposed to with curly braces, as opposed to actually saying set or casting a tuple to a set, seems pretty nice. There are keyword-only arguments. This one took me a little bit to think about, but this is sort of something kind of idiomatic we do where we're using class-based views in Django for some of our newer things. And get context data is this idiom that, as you might expect, returns a dictionary for the request context. So it conventionally has a very permissive signature, ** quargs, because different mix-ins or different base views will want to take different parameters. Well, we also have our own mix-ins, and so we end up writing these things that sort of look for something in quargs, do something if it's there, and then pop it out before calling super. Well, with keyword-only arguments, this makes extension a lot nicer because, well, now after ** quargs, I can say foo equals none. And now foo cannot be inside of quargs, and I don't have to pop it out. I don't have to, I can actually say, is the value already set? I don't have to get it out manually. And this just seems like a much nicer way to write things that extend signatures with very permissive argument lists. There's a bunch of other favorites. I have, there's Saner meta-class declarations when you need them. The views instead of lists in many places. There's some shared memory for dictionary keys, which is sort of this interesting thing I haven't looked at much, but seems interesting. Maths that actually work. And email the email packages have been revamped that we use a lot. So there's a lot of these things that I actually want to be able to use. And the thing that's cut off on the bottom of the slide is more iterators. So there are more iterators in more places as opposed to making lists in memory when you get the keys of a dictionary, that sort of thing. So the final one is, though, strings are Unicode. So there's no more implicit encoding or decoding from byte strings to Unicode strings. And this isn't all great, but this is explicit, and explicit is better than implicit. And the reason this is so exciting and important for us is that, remember how I told you our code base is kind of old, or there's parts of it that are kind of old? Well, we have this thing called ADB, which is a homegrown ORM that predates Django. ORM is a little bit of an extravagant label, but by the way, I did this talk for my coworkers, and they said, "Are you really going to tell them all these secrets?" And I said, "Absolutely, because it's important to demonstrate all of the decisions you can make and still be successful." So on the left-hand side, you have sort of this Django ORM call to get an event, get its name, and you saw it's Awesome Town Days. And there's something on the right that's ADB, roughly the equivalent, except it's like a method, not a property. But you notice there's this U here. Django returns Unicode strings, and ADB really, really, really wants to return UTF-8 encoded byte strings. So, like, the Unicode string thing is going to be massively painful for us, but it's going to remove this other, like, ongoing. It's going to be painful once when we actually do it, as opposed to removing, this sort of ongoing pain where people are working in both sides of the code base and have to remember, oh man, that HTML stripping function, I actually have to figure out what context I'm calling from to know whether I should return Unicode or UTF-8 bytes. It's embarrassing. So I also wanted to figure out, like, how hard is this? Is this actually, with a huge code base, how is the tooling, how far advanced is the tooling? How good are our tests? Just what is this going to entail? Will I get false positives as far as things that seem like they work but really don't? And of course, why not? So more specifically, why now? Well, Python 3.3 has shipped. The return of U is my subtitle. In Python 3.1, 3.2, you couldn't actually use the U character to denote a string. And so the reasoning is sort of, internally consistent. It's superfluous. If strings are all Unicode, why would you say that it's U? Well, it turns out that people have a lot of U's, the letter U. People have a lot of the letter U littered around their code base, and it makes it harder to port. So this is back in 3.3. It doesn't do anything, but it's back. So that means this is approachable, and Django 1.5 has shipped. And this is the first release to actually officially support Python 3, probably support it at all. And the stated documentation goal is that they want to offer first-class production-ready support in 1.6. So now is sort of the time to figure out how hard this is going to be when 1.6 actually ships. So, how are we going to go about this? Well, I saw a talk last year at OSCON, Jacob Kaplan-Moss talking about how Django is slow and how you can fix it. And one of the comments he made that kind of stuck with me is this idea that your framework has to be general, but your application does not. And so what that means is Django supports a bunch of different databases, a bunch of different sort of hosted environments. Something like Eventbrite, we're not going to switch from MySQL to Postgres. Probably. It's like, we've invested in that. We know that's our deployment strategy. We've sort of cultivated expertise in this particular stack. And so we can sort of specifically target that. And similarly, our strategy for Python 3 adoption can be different than, say, the strategy that Requests or Flask or something else might take, where they have users that are both on Python 2 or 3, 2 and 3. We're really only ever going to be deploying on one version of Python. So like our sort of overlap period is much smaller, and that really informs our strategy. We have, we have sort of like, I started thinking about this and divided up the work into 4 areas: dependency, tests, code, and data. And I'm sort of explicitly not talking about data in this talk because, it just didn't go well enough to get that far. But these are sort of the things I knew I was going to have to address. So getting our dependencies upgraded, looking at tests, making sure those all run, and then our actual code. We have 125 external dependencies. Sort of sucks. And actually, this is actually a fully resolved graph. It's 125. So we sort of know how big. I mean, it's a bigger number than I would like, but this is the dependencies of all of our dependencies of all of our dependencies. So but the strategy, my first strategy was like first upgrade the major dependencies, and this is sort of the first point of woe in this story because Django 1.5 supports Python 3. It's pretty great. MySQLDB does not. There are a couple of forks of MySQLDB that have been ported up to Python 3, but they're sort of in various states of testedness or completeness, and I know better than to ask our operations team to, hey, we're going to do a huge major version of Python, and I want to use this, MySQL driver for our core relational data store that's not the real one. How do you feel about that? But this is my first idea. My first task was to upgrade these. Then there's a tool called Modernize that we can run on our code. So Python 3 ships with something called 223, the number 223, which is a tool for translating your Python 2 code into Python 3. Basically, you give a Python 2 code to start with, and it goes through and does the refactorings that it can. So it uses this lib 2 to 3, and so does Modernize. Modernize, though, has a slightly different goal, which is to emit code that will run under both 2 and 3. So it uses a compatibility library called 6 to do that. 2 times 3 is 6. And I don't know why I'm explaining the math joke to you. I mean, you guys all obviously get it. So, but even though we don't want to support Python 3 down the road, or Python 2 and 3 at the same time, I think it'll be clear in a moment why I chose Modernize as opposed to 2 to 3. So then we're going to test it and repeat. And so you get this strategy that looks something like this. So I may have failed to mention that we're actually on Django 1.4 right now. So the strategy actually looks like this, like 1.4, 2.6, 1.5, 2.6, 1.5 with Modernize 2.6, and then huzzah, 1.5, 6, and 3.3. So this is sort of the steps I was trying to move the code through. And then, of course, there's the data, which we didn't get to. So where are we? Well, so 2 to 3 and Modernize uncover some hilarity. And this is like, people who work with me know that when I say hilarious or hilarity, I mean funny, uh-oh, not funny, ha-ha. There's these things, mixed imports. Somebody in like 2007 thought it would be a good idea that if you had global variables, if you had global state, you should put them in a module called globals. Never mind the fact that this is a built-in function name, and when you import it, you're going to mask the built-in. So that's sort of embarrassment number one. But it turned, because Python 3's import semantics are slightly different, it always assumes, unless you say otherwise, that you're starting at the top level of your path. When you have things here like login and globals are things that we've defined, and random is a standard library module. If you have them on the same line, well, it can't convert that correctly. It's not going to try and figure out which ones are supposed to be local and which ones are supposed to be global. So you have to split these up and go through and fix this. That's fairly easy to fix. There are some string exceptions that our libraries are still raising. These have been deprecated forever. Remember I said this is sort of like an archaeological dig, but they're just totally out in Python 3. So got to fix those. There are some places that have Misty encoding directives, and this is sort of interesting. So most people know that Python 2 has byte strings and Unicode strings, but something that you don't always stop to ask yourself is, which one is my source file? And and if it's a byte string, how is it encoded? So the answer, of course, is it depends. And it depends on what version of Python you're operating in. And so starting like Python 2.4 or 5-ish, there was this, they added the ability to put these encoding directives at the top of your file to say, hey, heads up, this file is encoded as UTF-8 or Latin 1 or something else, or ASCII, whatever. But the default was still ASCII. Python 3, the default is UTF-8. And so we actually had some files, specifically like there were test running files that had Latin 1 encoded characters. And so 2 to 3 complained about this, and you had to go in and actually add the header to be explicit. One of the things I really liked about working on this project, and this is sort of my first, Python 3 experience, is trying to do this. But I like that things seem much more consistent now. There was some obviously dead code. And that's sort of like typos. So obviously this file was never being used because this never blew up. So I guess the actual title for this talk is like 499,999 lines of Python 3. But hey, delete the files. So then we started working on the upgrade to Django 1.5. So that ORM I showed you, the ADB stuff, yeah, it's sort of painful in an ongoing way, and we're really trying to address that so we can stop paying this tax of having it around. Basically, it can't write nulls to the database. I'll just let that sink in a bit. Doesn't matter what your data definition is, it can't write a null. And so, and actually I should have put a slide in here about this because it's sort of hilarious. The reason it can't write a null is because it uses those methods I showed you that like .name. Well, that's actually a getter and setter all in one. And so if you pass it a parameter, it sets the name. If you don't, it gives you the name. So how do you know whether you have passed a parameter or not? Whether or not it's none. And so that parameter can never be none, and you can never write none to the database. Or null. Womp womp. Django 1.5, the MySQL layer, actually is like, hey, you're trying to write a 0 to this column, and 0 is not an okay primary key value. I have a problem with this. Or an auto increment value. So, and it writes 0 all over the place because 0 is of course what you use when you can't write null. So there's a lot of like fix the test and try again. So you run modernize after you've done this and you see what happens. That's what happens. That is yes. So the question is that a real screenshot? And this is absolutely a real screenshot. Well, I mean, the sort of like orange frowny face is not real, but like yes, the dots and the E's are real, which is sort of interesting because like there's this interesting like pattern here, like every other one of these. So this is probably one of the tests that actually tests that our Django model and our ADB model is doing the right thing, and like Django is and ADB is not. Just guessing. And in summary, we ran 2,761, and we erred on 2,964, so there were literally more errors than actually executed tests.
That's confusing.
It is. It is confusing. And basically what this means is if your test throws an error, it doesn't get counted, right? If an error is different than a failure. So a failure is like an assertion is wrong or something. So the upside is there are only 61 failures. That seems like, approachable. But 50% of our test suite doesn't even run at all. That's unfortunate. So this is sort of where we are, like with the Python, with like the straight Python 3 port. But I had this other thought, which is sort of like, what about Eventbrite Lite? So I mentioned that the MySQL DB dependency doesn't work quite right, and that it's not officially ported up. And this seems to be one of the big problems. So I started thinking about like, well, what about SQLite 3? how bad could it be to run our site on SQLite 3? And could, or at least not run it, but like at least could I get the test suite to pass? And so about that, remember that quote I showed you earlier about how your application doesn't have to be general case? Well, it turns out our application is really not general purpose. We make some assumptions. So our syncDB uses this bespoke schema.sql as opposed to actually like reading the models and generating them by hand. And that makes a little bit of sense when you consider that we bolted Django on after we'd already made a lot of these models. And that schema SQL is dumped from MySQL, so it bakes in some specific things. So I had this idea like, okay, well maybe I'll just disable that syncDB override, and I'll set the database to point to SQLite 3, and I'll run the stock one. Maybe it'll actually work. Well, today I learned we have models that point at the same table, which is not, if you know anything about Django, is not allowed. They sort of selectively expose columns, which I don't feel good about. We repeat some model definitions verbatim in different apps. This is madness. So, yeah, that's, so Eventbrite Lite was a no-go as well. And so I'm sort of left, you know, that we're going to continue the port and hope that by the time we've fixed all of our ORM stuff, MySQLDB is actually ported up. So what are we doing now? What am I telling people on the team to do? It's not very interesting because all of our new code that we're writing is actually porting okay, and the tests actually seem to be okay in that area. We're using absolute imports, telling people to use that. This is the new import semantics that you can get in from the future. We're avoiding has key, exception comma. The exception comma is the old syntax. Exception as is what you should be using now. We had a few old style classes lying around, or people who are still writing them and didn't know any better, so telling them, helping educate them. It's like an archaeological educational experiment. And we're trying to pay attention to what's in under future and see where we can actually get some things there. So the questions we still have to ask ourselves, though, are things like, are we actually going to invest time importing these dependencies ourselves? It seems unlikely. Like, it doesn't seem that there's a lot of syntactic benefits and things that we would like to see in be able to use in our code base, but it's unlikely that it's a big enough business win for us to actually do this ourselves, unfortunately. How is this Unicode change actually going to impact our stored data? Like, this one's probably the most terrifying because all this code assumes that there's these UTF-8 encoded byte strings that come out. That's not going to be the case anymore. How are we actually going to go about throwing the switch? So we've done Django upgrades. We've done 3 since I've been at Eventbrite. We were kind of behind when I started. And 2 of them have gone great. 1 of them has gone not so great, but it was not disastrous. This is obviously a much bigger conversion. So even our 2.7 upgrade is going to be pretty straightforward. With that one, we're just going to start spinning up other machines in EC2 that have 2.7 because it'll be the exact same code base. That's not, if the semantics change or things change as we move to Python 3, that's not going to be the option. So we don't really know how we're going to do that yet. But overall, this has been a project that taught me a lot about how our code is actually put together and what is actually there. And it's been a pretty instructive experiment in working with a long-lived code base. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to entertain questions about Python 3, our code base, or other hilarity. Thank you. And there are some resources as well that I used when I was working on this, and those are linked from that URL. Yes?
Have you explored any of the native Python MySQL drivers like PyMySQL?
So the question is, have we explored any of the native Python MySQL drivers like PyMySQL? No. So I know they exist. I don't know if they actually, if the Django backend will work with them, which is sort of a key question for us. if they are sort of interface compatible with MySQL DB, then we could probably drop them in for our legacy bit, and that might be kind of interesting. I mean, the other thing I didn't mention is that having these two ORMs, they're not totally distinct anymore. A lot of the old core stuff routes through the Django ORM now transparently, and so that may sort of increase our dependency on what Django does there with MySQL. Yeah.
Part of this, it seemed like a lot of the early issues or a lot of the early things you got caught out. Do you employ any sort of like a linter because a lot of like the typos and even some of the bad style stuff, it seems like something that makes a good case for having a linter as part of your.
So the question is, it seemed like a lot of the earlier issues we ran into with obviously dead code, mixed imports, that sort of thing could have been solved by a linter. We don't. So I think it's obvious we have not always employed a linter. I don't think that's whatever. We actually do apply a linter now as a commit hook, but it's not. People can obviously work around it. And it only lints your diff because some of these files are pretty huge, and so asking people to delint everything, their job is not to delint, their job is to. Yeah, exactly. And so I'm not totally sure the linter would have picked up the mixed imports thing because that was much more like something that 2 to 3 can't handle.
That's the import globals.
That's the import globals, yeah, or importing both like random from the standard library and foo or whatever your module is, yeah. That's
the other part, I guess, for the mixed imports, like a mixture of a linter and pep8, I guess, something
yeah,
like that.
yeah. So I wouldn't say that we are late adopters of pep8, but it was not. Basically, there's a culture shift that happens in a lot of organizations, and it happened in ours, where they went from the early days where they were just kind of programming as fast as they could to figure out what the product was going to be, to actually trying to engineer something. And so, pep8 is definitely part of our culture now for the new things, but the sort of legacy stuff, we've tried to be pragmatic about, when we touch specific parts of it, we refactor and try and make it better, but we've sort of decided as a business we're not willing to go dark long enough to completely rid ourselves of it. That's just the decision we made. Yeah?
With the dependencies that you have you been able to kind of analyze and see how dependent you are on some of those, and maybe if some of them could be switched over to things that are Python?
Yeah. So the question is, with the set of dependencies we have we analyzed to see if there are alternatives or things that we maybe could even get rid of completely, to make the move easier, either because the new one's on Python 3 or we can get rid of it, right? So we did a little bit of looking at that. Sort of the major offenders for us that are still not ported, like I said, there's MySQL DB. Babel is the other one that is it's a localization framework, and those are the two that sort of stick front of mind. So I did, but we did not do any deep analysis of whether we could switch to something else. That's all in the back. Babel just got ported by Armin the other day. That's you'll notice that like 2 of my resources here are Armin, and so I've sort of made it a point to listen to what Armin has to say. Yeah.
So you're on 1.4 Django now.
That's right.
Do you have any one big headache in 1.5 is where they change user profiles and all that stuff? Is that going to cause you guys issues?
So the question is that since we're on 1.4 and we're going to have to go to 1.5. Will the change to user profiles affect us? And the answer, gratefully, is no, because we. So there's this funny thing Kenneth said this morning, earlier today, that was funny. What she basically said, well, if you want to use auth, you have to use sessions. And I thought, that's not right, because we don't actually use the session. We don't have the session middleware enabled, and we don't use any of the Django auth stuff. So because we were moving from the if we were conjoining Django with our legacy stuff, we wrote our own auth when they first adopted Django that basically implemented it in a compatible manner. And that's sort of a bummer because we had to write our own, but at the same time, it's basically
So you dodged a bullet, though.
we basically dodged a bullet. Yes.
Good that you Keep rewriting it all anyway.
That's right, and it does a few things that the Django one does not. So, in terms of like key rotation and that kind of thing. Anything else I can answer for people? Yeah.
Back to the dependencies for a second. You had mentioned that due to the business, you don't have time to support dependencies. Have you thought of putting a call in there for any, say, consultants who have open time to maybe pay them to do it?
So the question is, if we as a team are not willing to sort of sit and devote the time to porting up the dependencies, have we considered making a call to people who could maybe consult for us and do those? We have not. That's an interesting suggestion. Yeah, we don't have a lot of experience as a team in terms of outsourcing or contracting, but that's actually be a nice way to give back to the community too. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, when we did the Python.org revamp that's going to be rolling out soon, one of the things that we did do as a foundation is we said it's going to be Python 3, and if you find a library that isn't Python 3, then get that person on the phone or get the maintainer on the phone and drive them, control them, shame them. Shame always hurtful. But basically get them ported over, and the same thing is happening with more and more companies where they just basically approach the author and just say, hey, can you do this, and here's a check.
Cool.
It works out well.
Great. That sounds good. Yeah.
So it sounds like you have one monolith in Python 3. Have you considered porting over parts of it to Python 3 and sort of a staged rollout?
Sure. So the question is, it sounds like we have a monolithic app, as opposed to trying to port this entire pile of Python to Python 3. Have we considered doing it sort of in pieces and rolling it out incrementally? And that's actually a very good, very cogent question, because something we've been rolling out, or we've been moving towards, is more of a service-oriented architecture, and that is sort of interesting because when I was doing this project, I thought, well, that's really great because now I don't have to worry about any of the payments code, which is some of the, you don't want to screw it up. Like, you want to make sure you don't screw up the taking people's money or charging them, and that's because that's running as a service now. So it's sort of independent. It has its own deployment. And so yeah, it's very likely that if we decide to move forward with this, that at the time we actually sort of do it, we'll start with the services because they can be done independently and they have their own clusters and they just have to speak the protocol. And they also, because they're newer code, there's less of this sort of legacy ORM stuff going on. Great. Thank you very much for coming.